lesson 8 and just copy that into the lesson 12 template and overwrite mine. Okay, so it's lesson 12. So this week we have a lot to do. We're working with this starter application. So basically what I did here was I took our lesson 6, because at the end of lesson 6 we had create, read, update, and delete working in our drink store with no authentication. So I took that, I copied it, but then I stripped some things down and I removed a bunch of stuff we don't need for today. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna make an SPA, a single page application. So one page that contains the full CRUD functionality for drinks. So download this template. I've got mine set up here. And we'll have a quick look at what's in it. So I've got this lesson 12 template. So we're going to add some things, but I took out, there were a bunch of files that we were using for our multi-page version in class we did earlier that we don't need anymore. And we'll open it up in a minute. You can open it up in your code editor once you have it ready, and I'll show you what things I've changed. By the way, just while this is copying, I want to mention there's going to be a co-op posting coming up shortly at the college for next semester. The posting is for the it's going to be by the Office of Academic Quality. They need an internal website. It has to run as a subset of the college website, which means it will be WordPress, but they'll need a WordPress install. They have some ideas, but they don't really have a great idea of, we talked about it. I met with them. We talked about it as a class project, and we decided it wasn't really a very good fit for a class project, but I suggested to them what they'd really need was a co-op student for next semester for January to April. So keep an eye if you're still looking for posting. And they're looking for this group. I've advised you guys, your section of programmers and the other 2 sections, you guys are pretty much the only computer studies students on co-op in January. The web students are not. So that posting should be coming up on Orbis very soon. So if you're looking, you'll want to keep an eye out for that. Okay, so I finally have my folder ready. So I'll open it up in my code editor. And yes, we should be able to kick it off. The only question is what database connection you're using. But it should run right out of the box as it is. So I kept only what was needed for today. So the only change that you may need to make is just replacing. You may just need to replace this file with a database file that you already have that's working, where you have your drinks collection. Because we're going to work with that same data set we already have. We're not going to recreate a new collection. So I'm going to run my local MongoDB. If you're already using MLab in class, that's fine. Just copy a file in which has your MLab connection string. Because I'm going to run this locally, in order to kick it off, I need to launch my local MongoDB because I'm not using MLab. I'll just run my local MongoDB server. If you're connecting to your local MongoDB, you'll need to do the same. So now that my database is running, I can open another command prompt. And we can actually start up our application. there it is. We're going to be able to do everything. There's only one view. The view is index.ejs. We don't even really need to use the EJS extension for this. In fact, this could just be an HTML file. There's no EJS code on here. It's just going to be HTML and Angular only. So there's no real reason why we need the EJS template. So probably the functionality should be fairly self-explanatory. You can see the buttons, you can see all the things we want to get working. So here's what we're going to do in order. First thing we're going to do when our page loads, we already have data in our drinks collection. We want this table to be populated. So as soon as our page loads, we want to query MongoDB, we want to fetch the data, and we want to use an ng repeat to populate our list. So we'll do a read operation first. Then we'll get our form working. So as soon as we add, it adds to the list below, kind of like we did last week with our in-memory version without the database. Then we'll do delete, which is the simplest. And we'll do edit last. Edit will be the most complicated because when we click edit, we're going to want to populate our form above with the selected document. We'll want to have an update button here that triggers an update instead of an add method. And then we'll save it and we'll want that update to be refreshed in our list and our form to be cleared out. Yeah, so this is kind of where we're going. So I kept the global vars. I kept our drink model. I got rid of the account model. There's no authentication on this. So the drink model is the exact same file. I haven't made any changes to it. Our public folder is exactly the same. I got rid of the drinks.js. So before, our drinks controller, it handled all the routing and did all the calls to our model for create, read, update, and delete. That's going to get changed because this is a single page application. Right now, I took out all of the routing because so rather than having a separate controller for drinks, we're just going to do everything in index. We really don't need a different controller because there's only one page in the application. And we're still going to write these root handlers, but they're going to be different. And now in views, I got rid of almost everything. There's no partials. And there are not different views because we're doing everything now in index.ejs, right? So if we open it up, it's got the full header, style sheet links, and our section, our form section at the top, and our table section at the bottom. So I've kind of combined the HTML from our add drink EJS and our drinks EJS, right? The drinks had the table and the add drink had the form. I've put them together as well as the header and footer. All that stuff I just smushed together. So we've got one file. Okay, so now it actually runs. So this is the only page we're going to load. And every time we're changing data, we won't need to do any kind of refresh. We just load the page once and the user can work with the data. So it gives them a faster experience. They're not waiting. It reduces bandwidth because we're not sending all this HTML back and forth. We're only sending the data back and forth. So just to give you a picture of kind of where we're going, right now, sorry, in our lesson 6 version, just draw this out for a little bit. I'm just going to kind of map out what we built before. So then we had our press controller. And then we had our when we built out the application the first time, this is kind of how it was structured. sort of like this. Figured I'd draw this little diagram at the start of class because on the Wednesday section, a lot of people, they couldn't quite figure out what we were doing. They were following along, but the people's hands were going like, I don't get it. Like, why are we, this seems way more complicated. It was way simpler before. You're adding a whole bunch of code and several layers into this. So once I drew it out, this kind of seemed to make sense. So, right, this is how things talk to each other. When we wanted data to display on the view requested a route in the controller decided to execute a CRUD method on the model, would talk to the DB, and then the chain came all the way back, right? Today, we're kind of going to be injecting a few new pieces into this. So you're going to think, well, hey, why are we writing more code than we want to write less code? We actually are going to have to write more code because we're going to use Angular to kind of break this up a bit. Well, actually, oops. So we still want these pieces. It's going to get rid of this one. But now we're going to have a couple things sit in between. We're going to have an Angular controller. And we're going to have an Angular factory. The Angular controller, and I'll save this diagram and put it up on Blackboard. That kind of deals with between Angular and the client. The Angular factory is the interface that deals with our server. I'll just move these down a bit so we can see a little better. Now, in many applications, these Angular files, there'll be two separate files. We'll write a client file and we'll write a server file, and they'll talk to each other. For simplicity today, we're going to put this stuff in one file, but we'll have two sections. So the top part will be our factory, and the bottom part will be the controller. So we're adding, in effect, two layers in between the view and our Express controller. So it means we're going to have to repeat functions. So if we have a function in our controller that gets all the drinks, we're going to need an Angular function here that does that and an Angular function here that does that. So we're almost going to have three versions of the same function. But we need to do this in order to be able to create this all on one page with Angular and let Angular manipulate and control all the data. So these arrows, they're two-way as well. So it goes both from the client to the database as well as from the database back to the client. Okay, so we're adding this layer in here today. Okay, so I'll come back and probably refer to this little diagram as we go along. The one other change I made in app.js, I took out everything that we added to app.js. So I took out the drinks router. The only thing that's here that doesn't come from the generator is the database connection, the Mongoose reference and connecting to our database. Other than that, every other line in here is just what the generator builds. So I took out passport, we don't need it. So it's basically our run-of-the-mill Express generator plus the database connection. That's it. Now we are going to need one other file, and I've put the link on Blackboard. So if you're not in Blackboard, jump into the lesson 12. Folder. We need to download an additional Angular library. right down here at the bottom, there's a link to Angular UI router. So this is an Angular class that allows us to route URLs, kind of the way we've been doing it in our Express controller, right? We want to map a path and then do something. So in order to do that with Angular now, we need this library. So if you so I've linked to the CDN, just right click this link and save it. And just save it in the public JavaScripts along with the other JavaScript libraries we have. The Angular core library, jQuery, as well as our own custom script file. That's where we will write our own Angular code. So just save that file. And now you'll see it here in your public JavaScripts. So the Angular application we use is going to require this as a dependency. So we'll make a reference to it. So we also now need to add it to our list of scripts here. So in the bottom of our index.ejs, below, not above, the Angular core library, let's reference angular-ui-router.js. So we need this in order that our Angular factory can send URL calls to our Express controller. So now let's start wiring up. We basically, in order to populate our list, we're going to have to write code in 4 different places in the application. And I'll keep coming back to this diagram. So the first thing we're going to need to do in our client side is we're going to need some Angular directives to connect our HTML to an Angular application. And then specifically, we're going to need some directives within our HTML table so that our list of rows repeats. We get a loop to show all the data.
But the Angular UI router, is the reason we didn't have that before just because we weren't interacting with the database?
Yeah, because we weren't making any calls to anything else. We just loaded one page and we weren't doing anything else. So we're going to need to add Angular directives in our client, in our EJS view. Then we're going to need to build the controller. We've worked with the controller before, so what we do in there is going to be similar to what we did the last couple of weeks. But then we need to write the factory part. So this part's going to be the new part. And the factory is then got to make a call to our Express controller, a GET request. And our Express controller is going to do some things that it's done before, use the Mongoose model to go and fetch data, but then it's going to change. Because previously our controller would fetch data and then our controller would render a view. Well, we're not rendering the views from the controller anymore. That all happens in here. We just want the controller to run the query and send the data back to Angular. So there won't be a view being rendered. We've already rendered the view when the page first loads. So the Express controller is just going to hand back some JSON data to our factory, which will hand it back to the controller, which is rendered in the client. So we'll start here and we'll write the code here, then our controller, then our factory, and then we'll write the Express route. So we need some directives. What are the first few directives we need to add into our HTML and where should we add them? Because right now this page has no connection to AngularJS at all. It's just straight HTML.
You could put ng app on the main.
Yep, so let's declare an app. We may as well do another directive there too. So we'll call this the drink app. What other directive should we put on here besides the ng app? Thank you. We'll also want to set the NG controller. I called it singular, so I'll make this one both. So now every element, every HTML element within the main section is accessible to Angular. Okay, so we'll declare the app and the controller in our main tag. Doesn't have to go on the main tag, but that's not a bad place to put it. So now if we come down to our table, we need another Angular directive somewhere. What directive should we use and what line number, what tag should we attach it to? We want all the drink documents to appear in our table. So which tag are we going to attach and which directive are we going to use? Okay, we could put it in the table. Well, I would suggest there's a very specific tag in this area. We could put it on the section, we could put it on the table. I'd put it somewhere else. Let's think about which directive do we want to use. We can look last week in your code at the table that or the list that we built. I think we just used a list. We didn't use a table. Which directive do we use that in Angular that will generate a loop? It's not ng loop. Yeah, we want ng repeat. So which HTML element do we want to repeat? Do we want to repeat the whole section? Do we want to repeat the whole table, or do we want to repeat something else? Skara?
Maybe repeat rows.
Yeah, so which tag specifically, which line number? Well, the TH tags, keep in mind, what does TH stand for? Yeah, table heading. Yeah, but how many times do we want the headings to appear? Once or for every row in the table? Just once. So if we put ng repeat here, it's going to print the heading before every row. So we're getting warmer. We don't want it here. Yeah, on which line number? You got it. That's where we want this to repeat. Right? Everything outside of here, we only want once. One table, one section, one table, one header row.
We should have people that have it where you did do the headings and you just do the column names and it basically a dead end page that could work for any database. Because if the database changes, then
yeah, you could make those dynamic, but we don't want to use ng repeat. Because if we use repeat, that heading row is going to load.
I mean, like, could you not do, how would you do it then? We want to go and print, like, let's say we have a new table and it has like an extra 3 different headings. Like, how would you be able to make it so that it would automatically print those headings? Or has an extra 3 columns so that are not in this table? So
you would need an array in your Angular code that stored the names of the columns.
You would be able to get that from the
data. And then, well, yeah, or in your server-side code, you'd need an array with the column headings. And rather than hard coding them, you'd use a loop to generate a new TH here. So in here, we want ng repeat, E in drinks, and we will track by index so we know which element in the array each row is. So drinks is going to be our ng model, our array of our entire collection of data, and D will represent one drink in that array. So now in our 4 columns here from line 67 to 70, we need to output, actually I think I'm missing a TD tag. Oh no, because we'll put the size together. So inside of our first column, we want to use our handlebar syntax and output d.name. Code hinting yet because our model, our drinks model doesn't exist yet. Once we add the drinks model into our controller, we'll get code hinting here. Oh, actually we did get it, sorry. I didn't notice it. So it already knows it's based on the drinks model. We'll put two values in the third column. It'll be d.size, and then a space, and d.units. We'll put those together with a space. And then we'll print the drink alcohol percentage in the fourth column. So this should be all of the, these should be all of the Angular directives and tags we need in the front end to show the data. If I refresh the page, nothing's going to show up because we still have the other 3 sections we need to handle. So if I refresh, right, those values don't mean anything yet. Angular's not filling them, so they just show up as literal text on the page for now. That's fine. So now we're going to use our scripts file, which is our custom JavaScript file, to create the Angular application. We'll write the controller, we'll write the factory, and then we'll need to write our express controller. So let's open up scripts. We can get rid of this jQuery. We're not going to use it on here. I'm going to use slightly different syntax here. I'm going to actually create a variable called app. This is not related to app.js. This is just local to this file. And we'll create a new Angular application called drink app. Now, the last couple weeks, we declared our Angular applications like this with an empty array. Does anybody recall what that array means? So this array is a list of dependencies that our application needs. The last couple of weeks, our Angular applications haven't had any dependencies, but this week we have one, and that's this file that we downloaded, this class, the Angular UI router. So the name, the class name in that file that we need is UI.router. We need to specify that as a dependency in order for Angular to be able to make calls to our Express controller. So we'll just create the Angular factory here. Actually, you know what? We'll come back to that. We'll do the Angular controller first, and then we'll do the Angular factory. We basically have 2 sections in our file. And again, as I said, in many of the examples you'll see, they might break this up. They might put the factory, or there's a similar related object called an Angular service that some developers use. They're very similar. I won't go into the details. Won't bore you with them. But I found just for simplicity, we'll just put the factory and the controller in the same file. So now we'll create our controller called the drink controller. And our drink controller has two dependencies. Got the scope, which we've talked about, and it will depend on our drink factory. So all of our controller code goes in this section, and all our factory code will go in the section up above. So we're going to want to write all of our CRUD methods in the controller, and then we'll need versions of them in the factory as well. So the first thing we want is we're going to need to write a getDrinks method in our controller that sets up a scope level variable called drinks that our ng repeat can bind to. We're going to write a scope level getDrinks function. So now we want to call the factory, and the factory is going to have a getDrinks method, and that factory calls our express controller, which talks to MongoDB and hands the data all the way back down the chain. So we'll have we're going to call in our drink factory. We're also going to call getDrinks. We're going to have to write that method up above. And Angular allows us to chain function calls together with a then. So do this, then, kind of neat. We can get the response back. So we'll call getDrinks, we'll get data back, and then we'll set the scope.drinks, which is what's bound to our ng repeat. Our response has a data property. So we're using some Angular properties and methods. The Angular then method, as well as the response object, and the response object has a data property, which is pretty much what it sounds like.
So we're setting getDrinks to a function, and then setting it to response from that function?
Sorry. That should just be,
Okay.
sorry, yes. Thank you, my mistake. Good catch.
That's called a promise, right?
Yes. And in fact, I don't know if anybody I think in the Thursday section for the presentations, a couple students said, I'd put up presentation topics, and one of them said, can we do promises and remove something else? I said, sure. Yeah, so can you explain a little bit more about what a promise is? or what you know about it?
A promise gets around the fact that everything executes all at the exact same time, which hasn't been a problem for us so far. Actually, I just Megan yesterday how it's great that we haven't had a problem with it because I have doing Node and it's a pain in the ass. And promises basically guarantee that one thing will execute before another, and then something will happen. It's them. Because if you try to, like the example I used on my bot, like I'm loading like users from a group, but that takes time. And everything else is instant. So one thing instant happens, and another thing instant happens. But it needs to happen after something that takes time. It will never happen because it takes time. So
Right.
you want to make sure that thing that's instant happens after the thing that takes time. So.
Right. So that's part of where our then function comes in. So now we've written two of our four parts. We've done the first part. We've written our controller method, but now our controller is calling a get drinks method in the factory. Well, that method doesn't exist, so we need to write it. And that part's going to be fairly new. So let's create the factory. So we'll call it the drink factory. This has one dependency, which is the HTTP library. We need this so that our factory can make HTTP calls and pass URLs to our Express controller, to the server, to our Node.js code. So basically, whenever we work with our Express controller and get data back, Angular, kind of like we did last week, we're keeping an in-memory copy of the data, which we'll just call drinks. So all of our methods are going to interact with that drinks array. Now we'll write our factory drinks method. We need no parameters here. When we call the get method, we don't have to pass anything into it. We're just going to get everything. So what we're going to do is call get/teams So we use the HTTP library and we call a get method /teams. Oops, sorry. Drinks. That's what happens when you do the same lesson 3 days in a row. And then again, here's another, in effect, a promise. We also have success and failure methods built into Angular. So after we call that method, we can then check if it's successful. What do we do? Well, we have data that comes back. So we're going to take that data and copy it into our in-memory drinks array. We get a JSON object back. So copy the JSON response data to the in-memory drinks array. So Angular has a method called copy. Copy what? Copy the data object to our local drinks array. Whoops, sorry, this should be d.drinks. So there's step 3. So again, our controller interfaces with our view by using the scope, and the controller calls the factory, and the factory will call Express. The Express controller uses the Mongoose model, which talks to MongoDB, and the data comes all the way back along the chain. So we've now done 3 of the 4 steps. So now what we need, if we look at our index.js, is we need a router.get at /drinks. We can run this right now, but we're not going to get any data yet. I've already connected. So this used to be in our drinks.js. I've moved the reference into index.js because we don't have a separate drinks controller anymore. Now we'll get drinks. So this part will be, for the most part, pretty familiar, with one exception. A regular Express route. So we'll use the drink model. We'll call a find method because it's inherits from Mongoose. So we'll call drink.find, no parameters. Okay, so we're going to get back one of 2 things. An error is always the first parameter. A list of drink data is always the second parameter. We're going to get one or the other. We won't get both. So if we have an error, and remember, we're not rendering any views. The only view we're rendering is when the home page first loads. So instead, we'll just continue by saying return next and pass the error in. So if we have an error, our return statement will exit this function here. It won't continue. So we don't even really need an else. If there is no error, so normally we call res.render. We don't want to call res.render. All we want to do is pass back this object, which will be JSON. So in this case, no error, so send back JSON data. So we call res.json. Our Express controllers are no longer going to be rendering different pages. All they do is pass JSON back and forth, with the exception of the home page handler, which has to load the initial view. So we've now completely divorced the Express controller, with this exception, from our front-end code and our display. So now we could very easily reuse this model and controller in, say, a mobile application. We just build a different front end. Or we want to turn this into an API. Well, someone just needs to issue a GET request at localhost 3000/drinks, and they're going to get JSON data. We can try this. Let's go here for a minute. Let's do /drinks. That's what this method now returns. We're no longer rendering a view. It simply uses Mongoose, fetches the data, and spits back out a JSON object. So in effect, we've built an API. If we want to verify, I can validate that that's valid JSON. It should be. I can just go to JSON lint, paste it in, formats it for me nicely so I can read it, and it says, yep, that's good, valid JSON syntax. So all our controller does now is use, go to the database, and it's just going to hand back that JSON to our factory. Our factory copies it into a local array. It's passed to the controller, and it's bound to our ng repeat in our HTML table.
If this was like a production application, how would we prevent people from being able to look into our JSON document?
Great question. I was actually working with one the other day. Someone built a JSON API that I had to do some integration with. I'll show you the documentation. How about that?
Isn't the whole point that they should be like they are allowed, which is why you're setting them?
It depends whether some APIs are public and some are not. So this one is dealing with,
In my opinion, you should use any information that you send to a client, you should expect that they are going to be able to read it. So don't send them what they shouldn't be reading.
so Josh, here, first of all, each user is assigned a client ID and client secret. So you have to, they have to create the, you can't create an account yourself. The API owner creates that account and they assign you an ID and a secret. And you have to include that when you call the API. So that's one method. The other method is like this. So here, for example, if I want to get, you have to generate an OAuth access token. And that has to be included in the GET request. Not only the access token, but the ID and secret. So they have a list in their database. Every account has an access token. So if you call that, you have to pass in the access token and that will identify who you are. If you don't pass in that token, it's going to give you an unauthorized. So when you're building those APIs, you decide, hey, is this public or do I want to restrict access? So the ID, secret, and access token, that's kind of the standard way of securing it. You can also do it, I think they've done it in here in another way, where you can add an authentication header, a method header. So you call get or post, but then you have to attach those values as part of the header on your request. So that's another way of doing it. Okay, so we're almost there. So now, when I refresh my page, okay, something's happening because notice, right? Our buttons went away, which suggests our ng repeat is kind of working because our ng repeat, our drinks is empty. So we don't even get that first row anymore. So the question is, what the heck happened? Where's our data? We'll just check for errors. I'll look in my console. It's almost time for a break, but we only have one more thing to do. Okay. So we do have an error here, undefined for drink factory. So let's just go and check. I think so we know our express route is okay, right? We can run that URL and we get the JSON, the proper JSON. So there's no issue here. Let's go back here. We need to do one more thing. We've initialized our empty array. We're populating it with our get, but there's one thing we didn't do, which is return the current drinks list. We need to return that out of the factory so that our controller has access to it. Otherwise, this array, it's only visible within the factory. It's not visible to the controller. I think that will get our error solved. Okay, well, that certainly did something. Okay, so we need to return the drinks. Function data, I think that's right. So we're going to copy the data to our drinks array. Well, there is one thing we've missed in our HTML. We need to put it on. We may still have a little bit of an issue, but we've never actually called the getDrinks method. We're binding it to drinks, but nothing ever calls this function. We need another Angular directive we haven't used before. I'm going to go back up to my main tag. We want to use an ng init. Once this loads, we want to initialize it by calling getDrinks. That's part of our problem, although we may still have to tweak our code a little. So when Angular initializes, call that scope level method called getDrinks. Let's see what that does for us. Ah, yeah, solves our problems. So now we get our data showing up as soon as our page loads. So I've added this directive when we initialize, when we hit the main tag. So we've had to write a fair bit of code. We had to write 3 different get methods. You might think, well, that's kind of a pain, right? When we left Angular out, we only needed 1. Well, it's true. We did, but we won't get the rich experience of loading our page a single time and letting our user change data with 1 page load. We also technically, I mean, do we need the factory? Not really. Could we just use the Angular controller and interact directly with our Express controller? We could. It's not generally recommended as a practice. Usually we're recommended that we have a controller that talks to the view, and we have a separate object, the factory or service, that talks to our Express backend. That's recommended practice. So yes, it means more code. But I also think it's a little cleaner in that it breaks up the functions. This goes to the back end and hands the data back, and this goes to the front end. So we've completed one of our 4 operations. It's probably about time, almost time for us to take a break. When we come back, we want to write the add drink function. So we'll need an add function in our controller, an add function in our factory, and what HTTP method do you think we're going to call for add? It's not going to be get. Close. What method have we used before besides get? It does start with a P, but it's not push. Yeah, we'll write a post command. And then we'll write a post handler here that will save to the database, save that object to the database, and just send back a JSON response. And then we'll do the same with delete, and we'll do update last. And we should have time to get it all done. Are there any questions so far?
Sorry, could you tell me again what the UI router does?
The UI router allows us to route, to make HTTP calls and route them to particular URLs. If you take out that dependency, this function isn't going to fire when we call it. Can't execute. Well, that answer was completely wrong. I guess we don't need it for today. You know, I know why I had it in here. Good to know. You guys always get the better answers on Friday after I figure most of these things out. Here's why. Now that I think about it, I'm just going to pull up the video from last week. When I did this lesson in the past, I modified the templating slightly differently. I just wanted to pull up a quick piece of the video from last week. Sorry, 2 weeks ago. Here's why we used it.
AngularJS, information controllers are implemented. So if you look at some AngularJS code, you can see attributes and the application updates to show us just the records that map. That query attribute is going to be used to create. So that data can be full of input fields right here. And go to the HTML page, you can see that. Let me go ahead and delete. So just break up your functionality into modules. Application has a single module, but there's no reason why you can't create multiple.
Here's why. When I did it last week, the way he did it was he actually used 2 different HTML templates. There was one template that showed the list, and then when you clicked on an item in the list, it loaded a different detail. The list template was hidden, and he loaded in the details instead. So we had those as partials. So the UI router allows you to set up on one page and basically make a certain part of it dynamic, where you're loading in based on a URL, a different template. So when I did this lesson in the past, I used that piece. I found it kind of confused people and it took too much time, so I removed it in this version. But I forgot that's what I used it for. That's what the router was for. So so here he's routing with those. So specifying that way. We're not doing it this way where we have different partial views. So we actually don't need that.
So what you mean is, so like maybe if you would hit like the edit button, it might pop up like a little window, like on a certain.
Well, not even necessarily pop up a window, but it may be that we hide that stuff, that this is its own partial page. So we hide that and we load and edit HTML partial view instead. We need the Angular UI router for that. So we don't need it. So the first answer I gave you was completely 100% wrong. Okay, thank you for raising that. It's a good question. So yeah, I guess we could take it out. We could even blow away that UI router link. We don't really need it the way we've built it. Okay, I think it's time for us to take a break. Let's take 10 minutes. When we come back, we'll work on our add form and add functionality.